Healing is not curing. Sometimes we confuse the two terms. When we think of curing, it really comes from more of the pathogenic model. I have a disease, it's outside of me, and I need to seek some sort of outside agent to get rid of it. In my years and decades of research, both clinical studies and inquiring about healing from many different healers across the world, they all say the same things. First of all, they all say, I'm not doing the healing. They also say healing is a process, not an outcome. The goal here isn't necessarily to simply rid oneself of a disease, but to bring oneself back into harmony, body, mind, and spirit. And the way they describe this, and often they are sensing energy around the body, they may have certain protocols that they use to move energy freely through the body, but the purpose isn't just to free your energy, it's actually to bring you back to your spiritual nature. We have many different terms for it, right? God consciousness, soul, spirit, all of those. But what we learn from these studies and from talking with the healers themselves is that healing is ultimately a return to harmony. And that's within us and also with ourselves and our environment. Absolutely. So just like we thought our minds weren't connected to our immune system, and now, of course, through the field of psychoneuroimmunology, we know there's profound connections between the brain, the immune system, the endocrine system. In the same way, we're beginning to uncover the power of our energy, so to speak, and its relationship with healing. What we're learning is truly healing is part of our birthright. It's part of being human. It's a realignment with the vital force within us, that's how I would describe it, to bring about powerful healing. In science, we call this the process of salutogenesis, or the process of healing. We've heard a lot about the process of pathogenesis, or the spread of disease. In the same way, we can turn our scientific eyes toward the very real process of healing. We know that the body regenerates. That's part of the reason why sleep is so important, for example. When we sleep, what happens? Our immune system is regenerating itself. Our sympathetic, parasympathetic nervous system is coming more into harmony. We're allowing the parasympathetic nervous system, which is a big part of the restorative process in the body, to be fully free to renew and repair ourselves. So there's no doubt that there is just a natural fundamental process in the human body-mind toward healing and toward repair of the body-mind. But we must allow that process to happen. And part of that is to understand that it is our birthright. Healing is our birthright. You know, when the field of psychoneuroimmunology was birthed about 50, 60 years ago, it was during a time where we really were so disempowered, we didn't believe our emotions had effects on our immune system or our health. We began studying things like anger and depression and its effect on disease. And then we quickly learned that it's not just our negative states of mind that affect our disease patterns. It's our state of consciousness, and that includes our emotions and our mindset. So what we've learned from the data, for example, is that all of these spiritual practices, which we often call mind-body practices in the West, including things like yoga, meditation, prayer, tai chi, qigong, all have commonalities in bringing us back to an alignment of our mind and our emotions and our spirit. And what's interesting is when you look at the data, you see that whether you're talking about meditation in its different forms, many different forms of meditation, yoga, prayer, tai chi, qigong, they all have similar effects on the body. And that is to reduce inflammation, to enhance vagal nerve activity. Again, the vagus nerve is sort of the captain of our rest and digest system. So simply by engaging in a mind-body-spirit practice, we can promote powerful healing for ourselves. And it's worth it to remember that these practices weren't just about stress reduction, although that often happens. They aren't just about trying to get rid of a disease or a symptom, although that can kind of happen. Those practices were developed by indigenous cultures all over the world to bring us back to our spirit. And so it's in coming toward a pathway toward what we might call self-realization, where we experience the harmony that allows us to be more healthy, mind, body, and spirit. When we look at the mechanisms for healing, we have to think about this as being a whole system. We're looking at whole person healing, body, mind, spirit, emotions, physiology. So the idea of a singular mechanism, for example, a single biological pathway, doesn't make sense. Healing is happening on the physical level, the spiritual level, the emotional level. We can look at approaches like systems science to help us get a fuller picture of all of the different mechanisms that are at play in healing, because there are likely non-local effects, there are likely electromagnetic effects, and even effects related to human connection that we really need to look at to understand the whole picture of how healing is happening. We're really moving into an era of whole person health. And what that means is an integration of the best of what we know of Western science and medicine, along with what we have called Eastern or really indigenous understandings of medicine, because it's not just the East, it's native traditions, it's all over the world, really. And what that means is, in the indigenous traditions, we have understood health to be the whole person, always. Practices like Ayurveda, Chinese medicine, native medicine have always spoken about healing being the restoration of harmony with us and our environment. What we're beginning to discover as we dive into the science of whole person medicine is that our dogged fixation on materialism as an explanation for healing is largely incomplete. And it's largely incomplete because we can't explain things like energy healing, spiritual experience, and the very real effects that we're seeing on even the physiological body and the reduction of symptoms in patients. So we have to expand the model. A key area in the study of healing has been an area that we Western scientists call the biofield, or biofield science. And biofield was a term that was coined at the National Institutes of Health in the late 90s. And it was described as a massless field, not necessarily electromagnetic, that guides the homeodynamic functioning of a living organism. So what does that mean in plain English? We're talking about fields of energy and information that guide our health. And as we study the biofield, what we're learning is it's not just one field that we can study. Much like consciousness, we can study different aspects of it. There are so many practices that people engage in energy healing. It's often called energy healing. We call it often biofield therapies. Practitioners are working with the energy fields of a patient or a client to write the healing response. Some of them have very specific protocols. Some are more modern practices like healing touch, therapeutic touch. Those are often integrated into clinical care. Many nurses practice them. They're very specific certification programs that you go to train. You do a certain amount of hours. And then there are the more ancient traditions that aren't so prescribed, but have been existing for millennia, where healers are saying they're doing the same things. And that includes things like laying on of hands. There's Satnam Rasayan in the Kundalini yoga tradition, many different traditions. The fundamental commonality between these is an expansion of consciousness of the practitioner beyond the conditioned mind, where they're able to allow for the flows of energy to flow through them to the patient or the practitioner to write their healing response. So some are very prescriptive. I'm going to do, sort of this movement, magnetic clearing along the body. For this ailment, I'm going to do this thing. For this ailment, I'm going to do this thing. Some of them work like that. Some of them are literally just about holding space. In both cases, it seems that there is an effect on the healing process. In both cases, the practitioners report, I'm not doing the healing. I'm a healing facilitator. I'm allowing for the currents of compassion to flow through me to this client so that they can better realize their true nature and therefore liberate their healing force. Most all Biofield healing practitioners that I talk with say that healing is possible at a distance. It's really a matter of personal preference, how they practice, and also practicality. You know, for example, during the pandemic, people were locked down, they were isolated. They could not necessarily go see a healing practitioner. And I found that many of my colleagues were actually practicing at a distance. For example, I've done my own studies examining the effects of these Biofield energy healers on functions in patients, like in cancer and in pain and in post-traumatic stress. Now, another study that I did conduct, which was very rigorous, was a randomized placebo-controlled trial looking at the effects of a different hands-on healing approach, so this was hands-on the body, for fatigue in breast cancer survivors. And this was a study that I conducted at UC San Diego. So what did we find? With the women who received actual hands-on healing, when we compared them to a sham healing group where we trained practitioners in how to mimic the hand positions in the same way, all the sessions were done in silence, we compared them with this group and also a weightless control group that didn't get any treatment during this 1-month period. We saw profound decreases in fatigue, significantly different from the weightless control group, and some nuances where we saw differences between the healing group and the mock healing group. The mock healing group also showed a significant effect on fatigue. What did that mean? Well, it's common sense, right? Coming in, laying on a table twice a week for 4 weeks, interacting with a caring community, being touched, being cared for, all of these things can have effects. For the mock healing group, we saw a decrease in fatigue to what you would consider for a breast cancer patient who is about to go through chemotherapy. We compared that with our data. So a decrease, not a major decrease, but a significant decrease. For the women who received the actual healing, we saw a profound decrease in fatigue, down to levels of what you would expect for someone walking down the street. Their fatigue level reduction was massive after only a month's time, so clinically as well as statistically significant. But what really blew me away was that it was only the women who received energy healing who showed a normalization of their endocrine rhythms, their cortisol rhythms, over the month period. Most of us have heard of cortisol, right? Stress hormone, we often think high levels are bad, low levels are good. But it's a little more nuanced than that. Cortisol, like most of the things in our body, follows a natural rhythm. And as it turns out, that natural rhythm in the body is important for health. In fatigue breast cancer survivors, we see that that rhythm is dysregulated. And there's been at least one study showing that the dysregulations in cortisol rhythm can be linked not only to depression and fatigue, but also mortality. So it seems like an important biomarker. What we discovered is that it was only the women who received energy healing that showed a normalization of their rhythms. And believe me, I actually did everything I could to explain away the results because for me at the time, they were unbelievable. Was it placebo? Was it belief? Was it relationship? Was it clinical variables like their body mass index or whether they had chemotherapy before? Could anything else explain these results? They couldn't. And that was very curious to me. And then I began to find out about other studies conducted by my colleagues at the University of Arizona, University of Iowa, MD Anderson Cancer Centers, where they were beginning to show how energy, so-called energy, is getting under the skin and affecting healing down to the physiological level. And these are studies that are done in humans, like mine, but there are also studies that are done with animals and studies that are done with cells. And they're all carefully controlled studies. They're published. I get into a lot of detail about this in my book. It has over 700 peer-reviewed published references in it, really detailing the data and these studies that are conducted by tenured professors at major universities that are showing this profound effect. And so the question is, how is that happening? How is that happening? And why is it that it's so difficult for us to believe these results? For the skeptical scientist, the clinical studies are interesting. Quite frankly, the clinical studies are very meaningful. We've shown, looking at the data, compiling the data across many, many studies, hundreds that have been done at this point, that these biofield healing practices like Reiki, healing touch, therapeutic touch, and others can mitigate pain for many different kinds of patients, mitigate anxiety and other types of symptoms, and have effects on physiology. But for the skeptical scientists, they will say, well, even if you had a placebo control, humans are complicated. There could be so many explanations. But do you really see this outside of the human? Do you see it in cells? Do you see it in animals? Some of the most provocative work that I think is going on right now is at MD Anderson Cancer Center, led by Dr. Lorenzo Cohen and his team. Dr. Lorenzo Cohen is the Distinguished Chair of Integrative Medicine Research at MD Anderson Cancer Center. He's been there for a couple of decades. He's very well known for his work in yoga, in meditation, and other integrative acupuncture and other integrative practices for cancer patients. But he, like me and many other scientists, are very interested in this area of the biofield. He has already published 2 studies at this point looking at mouse models of cancer. So in these studies, the mice are in cages and the healers are sitting across from them in the same room. And he has sham controls, which means that he is comparing the healer with just a regular person who does not have profound healing ability, who is mimicking the same thing. In these studies, which were initially conducted with a healer whose name is Sean Harabants, who is no longer with us now in the physical form, Sean would literally sit in front of the cages and sort of direct his energy at the mice in this way. And these were mice that had been injected with cancer. What Lorenzo found was when he compared the mice that had been treated with Sean to the ones that were treated with a sham healer, and this isn't just one study, they ran repeated studies. These mice showed a reduction in tumor spread throughout the body. The first study actually showed reductions in tumor size, and the replications of those studies showed reductions in tumor spread. But Lorenzo wanted to get more deep into the body and understand the physiological underpinnings. What was going on in the body? How could you explain this? They found reductions in inflammatory cytokines, which are immune transmitters in the body. Much like we think of neurotransmitters, these are transmitters that signal to other immune cells to do different things. He saw reduction in the cytokines that help drive cancer cells to spread. But not only that, he looked down at cell subsets, very specific types of cells that would drive tumor metastasis or tumor spread throughout the body. And he looked all the way down at protein kinase signaling and found evidence that this effect that he was seeing for the energy healing was happening all the way down to cell signaling levels. So again, this energy and information is having profound effects on the body all the way down to how cells are communicating with each other. And this is under very carefully controlled conditions. The data are published. The studies are ongoing. Part of the growth trajectory that we're on as human beings, and it's no different in science and medicine, is that we have to step out of our either-or thinking. Either it's physical medicine, conventional medicine, drugs, or it's so-called alternative healing. Whole person health shows us that we can foster our healing on the physical level, choosing whatever we want in the physical realm, whether it's chemical drugs, whether it's diet, whether it's supplements, whether it's physical exercise, right? It doesn't preclude us from our spiritual health, our emotional health, our relationship health. This is just, at this point, based on the data, common sense, right? It's not an either or. It's a both and. We are an interconnected system. We have all of these ways that we can foster our own healing, but to understand that when we step out of either or thinking about health and healing, we step out of models of disempowerment to empowerment. And sometimes that's scary. Because once we acknowledge that we truly are our own healers, that we are our best healers, then we have to take responsibility for our healing. So that doesn't mean we have to feel guilty or whatever, and we still want to seek help, right? Because we're all connected. We can seek help for our healing process. But we have to sort of stand in our own authority and power as healing agents. This is what is really exciting because we have new and fun tools to play with in Western science, in systems biology, in examining biophotonic emission and bioelectromagnetics. We can apply those tools to the study of these indigenous practices, and that is ongoing. There's actually a wonderful special issue in Nature where we have examined the relationship of systems biology outcomes, like metabolomics, for example, looking at the readouts of the metabolites in the body and linking them with Chinese medicine diagnostics. And in these studies, they determined that people who are in these studies, they determined that, for example, patients with rheumatoid arthritis, if a Chinese medicine practitioner diagnosed them as either hot or cold, as they do in their classification system, those actually mapped onto different metabolomic patterns. So those who were categorized as having more heat, sort of the heat disposition in rheumatoid arthritis, their metabolomic profile looked different. That's important because it actually guides what we might do with that subset of patients. So when we bring together indigenous practices with systems biology, we can get closer to what we call precision medicine, right? But we may not have to use very expensive ways to do that. If the categorization systems that were used in Ayurveda, Chinese medicine, Tibetan medicine, and other forms are just as relevant and easy, then those are low-cost ways to help figure out what kinds of things we would want to give a patient to write their healing response versus having to do a lot of fancy lab tests. So we can use those tests to sort of cross-validate the two different ways of exploring the human. But ultimately, we're going to use the way that's most cost-effective. And this is why you're seeing a huge increase in enthusiasm among the World Health Organization to employ indigenous healing systems back into whole person health to mitigate the suffering of global health problems, because it is very cost-effective. You come into the doctor's office and the doctor sits down and actually has time with you, first of all, to ask questions about how are your relationships? How's your job life? How's your spiritual life? How's your diet? You know, what areas are you wanting to grow and change in your life? You know, sort of really tapping into the meaning and purpose, as well as checking your body, your vital signs, your physiological functioning, your blood work. All of that is important too, right? It's not an either or. But tapping into these additional dimensions of whole person health will help to galvanize healing and mitigate the suffering we're seeing from chronic disease and chronic mental health problems. So this is very real, it's very reachable, and it's not an either or. We have to use the best of what we know from science and whole person health to dispel the notion that it's an either or proposition. Our consciousness is powerful for healing, and that is from the spiritual all the way to the physical. And we have the power to shift and shape that.